Hey! Dragon here. And I love F.E.A.R. I mention F.E.A.R. or Half-Life in practically every single video, and for good reason. These two games had a huge impact on the FPS genre, and since I've already ranked Half-Life games, let's rank the F.E.A.R. franchise from the worst to the best. Yes, that includes all of F.E.A.R.'s expansions. Also, give me a moment to complain about the fact that you cannot buy F.E.A.R. on its own on Steam. The only way you can buy F.E.A.R. on Steam is buying the complete bundle. Why? Why has it been like this for years? If someone only wants to play the first game, they have to buy all of them. Thankfully, you can buy the Platinum Edition of the original F.E.A.R., which comes with both expansions on GOG for much less, so do that if you just want the first game. Because boy, the F.E.A.R. pack is a terrible deal. Unlike today's sponsor, Into the AM, who has a great deal. Into the AM is extending their Black Friday sale to December 5th. Everything on their website is 30 to 80% off. On top of that, if you use my link, intotheam.com/dragonshirts, you can get an additional 10% off. This does stack. If you don't know who Into the AM is, they're a clothing brand. They make incredibly comfortable clothes that I wear pretty much everywhere. This is one of the few companies that I'm totally fine shilling for. They make really good products. They're incredibly comfortable, they don't shrink when you wash them, they stretch, they're durable. I do like their clothes a lot. Their shirts also have a bunch of really interesting designs, and not to scare you guys, but Christmas is less than a month away now. These shirts would be a really good Christmas gift, and you don't want to be shopping last second, so check out the sale. Again, 30 to 80% off site-wide, and go to intotheam.com/dragonshirts to get an additional 10% off. Huge thanks to Into the AM, and now let's talk and complain about F.E.A.R. F.E.A.R. Online. Yeah, you probably forgot this even existed. Hell, you probably didn't even know it existed. The geniuses over at Warner Brothers decided, you know what would make a great game? A multiplayer, only online F.E.A.R. game. Why? Why would you do this? There's multiple modes, co-op modes, and PvP. But get this, in order to play the co-op modes, which would be the closest thing you have to the original F.E.A.R., you need to use tokens. Your account can only have 3 tokens at a time, and yeah, this is a blatant cash grab to try to get people to spend money on their free-to-play game. Let's just forget this thing even existed and move on. F.E.A.R. Perseus Mandate. This was the second expansion to the original F.E.A.R., and it's a bit of a head-scratcher as to how it turned out so bad. It was made by Timegate Studios, which you'd think would be a red flag, but they made the previous expansion and that turned out pretty good. The story takes place adjacent to the original F.E.A.R. story, with characters that mean nothing and you won't care about. I've played this expansion many times and I don't even remember what the whole goal of this expansion was story-wise, but what's worse than the questionable story is the quality of the game. Immediately, parachuting in on the first level, you can tell how bad it looks compared to the base game. What the hell is going on with this lighting? This looks like a modded map I would find in F.E.A.R. Combat. Hell, I've seen modded maps that look better in F.E.A.R. Combat. Now, if it just looked bad, maybe I could get over that, but unfortunately the combat is much worse than the base game too. The map designs tend to be a lot more linear, and with the new enemies added in, well, they're more bullet spongy and overall just not as fun. Out of all the F.E.A.R. games, this is the one I generally want to play the least, ignoring F.E.A.R. Online. But you couldn't play that if you wanted to anyway. The servers were shut down after only a year and it was still an open beta. So at least you can play Perseus Mandate? If you wanted to. Let's just move on. F.E.A.R. 2 Project Origin. People have strong opinions of F.E.A.R. 2, and I am definitely people. Everything about F.E.A.R. 2 feels like a watered-down version of the original game. Melee suddenly just doesn't work anymore and is really buggy. Enemies feel stupid compared to the smart AI they used to be. Most combat boils down to them just running in out of an enemy spawner and you shooting them in place. No longer does it feel like you have a combat arena with enemies that can outsmart you. And the horror generally boils down to Alma popping out trying to give you a kiss, which isn't scary, it's just annoying. But wait, you may say, what about the school level? And you're right, that's the most frustrating thing about F.E.A.R. 2. Occasionally, they show glimpses of what it could have been. That level is a fantastic level, but it's not indicative of the whole game. I rank F.E.A.R. 2 so low because it tries to do what the original game did, but just does it a lot worse. F.E.A.R. 3. I know a lot of people will put F.E.A.R. 2 over F.E.A.R. 3, but I at least find the combat in F.E.A.R. 3 fun. The main problem with F.E.A.R. 3 is just that it's not a F.E.A.R. game. That is generally where people get really upset. While I do acknowledge that F.E.A.R. 2 is trying to be F.E.A.R., I think trying to be F.E.A.R. and doing it worse is a worse situation than trying to do something entirely different and being fine. F.E.A.R. 3 was actually a fun game if the only thing you're going in there for is just co-op combat, and it did have a few horde modes that I actually put a lot more time into than I expected to. But at the same time, it really does feel like you're playing a husk of what used to be. This, while being a fun action co-op game, is just not F.E.A.R. It's just nowhere near as good as F.E.A.R. used to be. F.E.A.R. 2 Reborn. This was the expansion to the original F.E.A.R. 2, and I distinctly remember my response to it. I was kind of disappointed by the original F.E.A.R. 2, so I thought that the expansion would just be more of the same, and then it ended up playing similarly to the first game. There was clearly a lot more love and care put into this expansion. Maybe love and care weren't the correct words, there was a cohesive focus to this game. This expansion explains how Paxton Fettel came back. You play as a replica soldier, and that's just badass. But even better than that, the combat encounters are just so much higher quality. You will fight in skyscrapers falling over. Combat arenas are more intricate. Enemies will actually bark you, they'll actually try to flank you. F.E.A.R.'s old AI feels like it's kind of coming back here. You will have heavies smashing through walls in a wooden maze to try to kill you. This was a really good expansion, much better than the base game. The only downside to it is it just makes me think what could have been with the original F.E.A.R. 2. Here's where we get to a massive jump to some of the best first-person shooters I have ever played in my life, starting with F.E.A.R. Combat. F.E.A.R. Combat may be a little bit weird to put in here, but do keep in mind, F.E.A.R. Combat shipped for free after the original game. For all intents and purposes, F.E.A.R. Combat is just the multiplayer version of the original game, but since it was released later and separately, I'll count it as its own game. It also just gives you the ability to talk about F.E.A.R. Combat. I loved F.E.A.R.'s multiplayer. This multiplayer was surprisingly deep. Even just from basic things like certain weapons having different walking speed or putting them all away and sprinting 1,000,000 miles an hour just to kick someone in the face. Maps were designed well, gunplay felt great. This game was a staple on this channel like 15 years ago before I took it seriously. Hell, I won tournaments for this game. I loved this game. It was just something I played non-stop. Unfortunately, the servers haven't been active for a long time. There was a community workaround, but it's kind of hacky and annoying. It's really not playable today. And now we're in the top 2. In second place is the original F.E.A.R. This is what started it all. And while a lot of people remember the horror focus of the original game, for me it's the combat that stands out. The horror was a pacing mechanic. It occasionally got me the first time I played, like the ladder scene that happens at the beginning of the game, and then you're afraid of ladders for the whole rest of the game. That is evil. But for the most part, the horror sections are few and far between. The game is mostly combat. And boy does it do that combat well. When you get into a combat encounter, there's already a squad there. You know who you're fighting, but they're constantly talking to each other. They don't just run in a straight line at you. If you haven't played F.E.A.R. before, it's totally reasonable that these enemies will end up flanking you, despite the fact that when you walked into that arena, they were all in front of you. F.E.A.R.'s combat feels like a multiplayer game in a single-player experience. Then you add all the extra quality, the sound effects, the atmosphere, the punchiness of the shotgun. F.E.A.R. is in my top 5 games of all time, and for very good reason. But at number 1, if you've talked to me, this is not a surprise in any way whatsoever, it's F.E.A.R. Extraction Point. This was the first expansion for the original F.E.A.R., and it still blows my mind that my favorite F.E.A.R. experience was made by Timegate Studios of all people. Extraction Point continues where the original F.E.A.R. left off, both in story and gameplay. The story, to me, is the perfect end to the F.E.A.R. franchise. It ends with Fettel winning. This wasn't a happy franchise. I couldn't think of anything more fitting than that. But as far as the actual gameplay goes, you remember how I said the original F.E.A.R. doesn't focus on horror too much? Yeah, toss that out the window. When horror pops up in Extraction Point, they're gonna stick around for a while, and they're a lot more extreme than the base game. Anyone that's played Extraction Point is going to have vivid memories of that hospital. You know the one I'm talking about. But on the flip side, the combat is just more F.E.A.R. with a couple new weapons that were really satisfying. I mean, you get a minigun for Pete's sake. You fight more enemies, have more intricate arenas. This is exactly what you want out of an expansion. Take the original game and build on top of it. I don't know what kind of voodoo magic Timegate had to do to make this game so good, but it is easily one of my favorite games. This might be my favorite expansion of all time now that I think about it. Unfortunately, it is unlikely that we are ever going to get another F.E.A.R. game, and considering how the F.E.A.R. franchise has gone, I'm not sure I even want that. So what we have is all that's left to talk about. Tell me in the comments your guys' list, but for now, that's this ranking. Hey, huge thanks to my YouTube members. You guys mean a lot to me. They get to see videos early. If you want to join, it's down by the subscribe button. Also, if you want to come hang out on my Twitch, it's down there in the bottom screen as well. Thank all you guys for watching. I'll see you next time.